Hi, this is Mr. Chandler. This lesson is going to look at Standard 1.2. We're going to look at the early developments of representative government in the colonies, which we talked about a little bit in Standard 1.1. We're also going to look at the influence of the British political system on the New World and how we brought some of the ideas from the British political system into our political system. One of the big concepts here you really need to understand is the Magna Carta, along with the English Bill of Rights, and then how the colonists really thought of themselves as being British citizens and that they thought that they had the right to be consulted when levying taxes, and how that's going to lead to the Revolutionary War. Our unique political traditions really developed because of the British system, along with the special circumstances that were over here. Every colonial charter that was granted by the king really gave the colonists the rights that they thought they had as Englishmen, and so they really thought that they had the exact same rights as any other Englishman. The most important political tradition was the Magna Carta. You don't need to know the details of how the Magna Carta was signed. What you do need to know is that it recognized the rights of Englishmen to be consulted when levying taxes. What that means is that the people believed that they should have the right to have a say in their taxes. And the way they would have a say is through their representatives. If they like a tax, then their representative can vote for it. If they don't like a tax, their representative can vote against it. They also believed very strongly in the fact that they should be protected by a jury of their peers, which was also in the Magna Carta. Another important document was the rule of law, which said that every member society had to follow the law, from the king on down to like the very lowest member society. The rules are very clear, well understood, and fairly enforced. Another important British political tradition was the Bill of Rights. This is not the same thing as our Bill of Rights. What it did was again re-emphasize the fact that the people had the right to be consulted whenever new taxes are passed through their representatives. And so this is going to make them upset later when they're not consulted about levying taxes. It also established religious freedom, which they thought they had in all the colonies, and these were incorporated into the colonial governments, and this is what's going to set the stage for American representative government in the way it is today. All the colonies established their own representative government in order to rule over their colonies and keep order, since the British were really too far away to do anything. It also helped get people to come over to the New World because they knew they would be able to vote. In Virginia, the House of Burgess was the representative government, and only property owners could vote, like we said many times before. This is going to be much better than it was in England and allow people to have more democracy, even though it is still very limited democracy. Another early form of government was the Mayflower Compact. This was a written document that established a government by the people. What's unique about it is that everybody in the society was equal, as long as you're a member of the church. And so this is a very big step forward towards democracy where all male members could vote, whether they owned property or not. All 13 colonies had established some form of representative government which set taxes. And so they thought that their representative assemblies were the ones that could set taxes for their colonies, not Parliament back in England. Another important event that happened in England was the English Civil War. You don't need to know the details of the English Civil War, but what you need to know is that the English government was too busy fighting the war, so they had to leave the colonies alone. And in that absence, the colonies developed their own forms of representative government to rule over them. And that's kind of the start of the idea of salutary neglect. The next important event to occur was the Glorious Revolution. You don't need to know the details of the Glorious Revolution, but what you need to know is that some Enlightenment ideas came out of it. In particular, John Locke's social contract theory, which states that the government has a responsibility to protect the natural rights of man, life, liberty, and property, and in return, the people then support the government. If the government breaks that contract by not upholding those rights, then the people can get rid of the government. John Locke is going to be a big influence on the early founders, especially Thomas Jefferson. It is very important to understand that Parliament's control over their colonies was limited because they were so far away and they didn't really have much of a desire to get involved as long as the colonies were making money for them. Remember, that's what America was founded for, to make money. And as long as they were doing that, then the British government did not really care that much. This is the policy of salutary neglect, when they just kind of left the colonies alone to let them rule themselves. This is not a bad thing. This is actually a pretty good thing. The colonial assemblies had the right to tax the colonial citizens. When that policy of salutary neglect comes to an end after the French and Indian War, then that's when the colonists are going to revolt and the war for independence is going to start. The road to rebellion really starts with the French and Indian War. It's part of a larger conflict between the British and the French, and actually starts over here in the New World. It's going to cause Parliament to have to raise a lot of money, and so that's going to cause salutary neglect to come to an end because they're going to have to start passing taxes on the colonies to make up some of that money. They're also going to cut down on smuggling because that's going to help bring in more money to England. And as a result of cutting down smuggling, they're going to start using admiralty courts, which is going to take away a jury of their peers, which is a direct violation of the Magna Carta. And so colonists are going to protest and start smuggling more, which is going to lead to more tensions between them and the British. The French and Indian War is going to cause the colonies to have to unite together for a common goal. And this has never happened before. This is actually drawn by Ben Franklin that was trying to urge the colonies to join together. Like I said, it's a major deal because the colonies had never been united in anything before. They'd always viewed themselves as being very separate. After the French and Indian War, the cost of the war caused Parliament to have to tax the colonies more in order to make money. It started with the Stamp Act, which was an act that placed a tax on all paper products. This really angered the colonists because they didn't feel like they had representation in Parliament, and they thought that their own colonial legislatures had that right. That's a very, very important concept, the fact that they thought the colonial legislatures had the exclusive right to collect taxes and not Parliament. That's going to lead to boycotts led by the Sons of Liberty and then eventually the Stamp Act Congress. Meanwhile, while this is going on, there are British troops stationed in Boston, and those troops are taking some of the colonists' jobs, and that's going to lead to a lot of tension, which is then going to lead to the Boston Massacre. In the Boston Massacre, 5 colonists die. It's really not much of a massacre, but what the colonists use it as is propaganda. In fact, calling it a massacre is propaganda. This picture by Paul Revere shows it as a massacre, even though that's really not how it went. What it was meant to do is to cause the colonists to get upset about it, and this picture does have that effect where the colonists get upset about the massacre even though it really wasn't a massacre. The next major tax that was passed was the Townshend Acts, which was a tax on imported goods. That's really what you need to know about it. And you should also know that the colonies really worked hard not to pay the tax by using boycotts, which then brought trade with the British to a standstill, which caused them to revoke the Townshend Acts. The next major act isn't a tax at all, but rather it was the Tea Act, which took away a tax on tea. And that way they could get tea more cheaply. But what it did was it created a monopoly for the East India Tea Company, and the colonists really didn't like that tea, and they didn't like being told what to do. In response to the Tea Act, the Boston Tea Party occurred, where the Sons of Liberty boarded a ship carrying tea for Boston Harbor from the East India Company, and they threw the tea into the sea. And that a lot of other harbors did the same thing throughout the colony. In response to the Boston Tea Party, the British government passed the Intolerable Acts, or they're called the Coercive Acts in Britain. And what it did was it closed Boston Harbor, put Boston under martial law where the military controlled the city, and then moved trials of government officials accused of crime to Britain. Therefore, they almost always got away with it because witnesses wouldn't travel. They also passed the Quartering Act, where the Bostonians had to let them stay in their houses, and the Quebec Act, which gave the Quebec province more control and the British more control over the colonies. In response, the colonies met together for the first time into a Continental Congress. They do not want independence. That's a misconception. They really want to try to fix the problems and create a unified voice so the British will listen to them. Not long after, the first shots of the war occur. There's a rumor that there are arms being kept in Concord, Massachusetts, so the British Army goes up to seize those arms, and then on the way there's a small little skirmish that happens at Lexington. And then there's another battle at Concord that happens just after that, in which the British were defeated by a lot of the Minutemen, which were the colonists that were the militia. And the War for Independence began right there. At this point, the war has started, and in the next unit, we'll talk about the Declaration of Independence and the American Revolution. If you would, please take the quiz on Edmodo and then turn in your notes guide. Thank you very much for listening.